Today I'm going to show you some of the files from the 5D Classic. We're going to look at the real world usable dynamic range from this camera. This is what you get walking around with the camera, and we'll see how much dynamic range there is. I want to show you that the camera has a reasonable amount of dynamic range, and I also want to show you some of its limits as well. What we get from exposing for the highlights, exposing for the shadows, or trying to get an exposure in the middle, when it works and when it doesn't work. So let's get into it, and I'll just explain exactly what's happening as we go along. I want you to look at the histograms, and I'll explain it to you as we go through it. In this instance, I try to get everything in one exposure, and this is a perfect example of the limit of the 5D Classic. If we look at the histogram, if I hover the pointer over the up arrow here on the right hand side, we can see the red just appearing where we're just blowing the highlights on the histogram, and on the left we can see just the very darkest parts of the picture. Now it's important to understand that when we see the histogram like this is the image as we took it, but there's depth within the file still. And what that means is that we're seeing a representation of where the file is at this moment in time. When I move my sliders around in Lightroom, what changes is that we get more out of the file, so the histogram will move around. There is more information than is being represented by the histogram at this moment. The histogram is just showing us a representation of what is on the screen. It's not telling us everything that's within the file. So when I look at a scene like this for the 5D Classic, I'm just blowing the highlights and I'm just blowing the shadows. I know that this is within the limitations of the 5D Classic, which is quite nice really, because the sun is rising over here in the background behind the Gherkin building, and we can see that the dark areas of the shadows are quite dark. So I'm not going to specifically edit this, we're just going to zoom in and have a little look around, and I'm going to try and manipulate the highlights and shadows to see what we can get. So let's zoom in now and see what this looks like. So we're at 100%. And we can see that there is detail in these shadow areas. There could be a little bit more. So let's bring up some of that shadow detail, just enough. One of the mistakes I see a lot of people doing when they edit in Lightroom is they just do this. Let's brighten it up as much as we can. Now that might be what you want, that's fine, but to just do that all the time isn't necessarily correct. But this is at ISO 400. Let's go into 200% and look. And you can see, considering that we're at ISO 400, we can see a little bit of noise we can see a reasonable amount of noise coming into these shadow areas here at 200%. If we come back to 100, that's not so noticeable, but it is there. But I think we've pulled back a tremendous amount of detail, considering that we're looking at the 5D Classic here. I don't think that many people would think that the 5D Classic can do that, but it can do it. So let's do the highlights now. Let's bring them all the way down and see what we get. Now we see here we've pulled the highlights all the way across. When we see these grey areas like this here, it can be that the area is so much brighter just in this section that we don't cover any detail. That doesn't have to necessarily be a problem. We don't have to have colour in every part of the image. We can just work with the fact that our highlights are going to blow in certain parts of the picture. So it may be that we accept it and we pull the highlights back slightly so it looks more natural. So by more natural, I mean that we go from white and fade across into blue in a more natural transition than, let's say, this does, where the transition just happens across this area. We've crushed white down to grey. That doesn't look realistic, because the sky shouldn't be grey in the brightest part on a bright morning like that. We should allow this to move back to white, recover some highlight detail, and allow that transition to move across. Look at the difference that's made. So we accept that some of the picture is going to go to white. This is just one way of editing, that you don't have to have detail all the way through in every instance, because sometimes the sky going to white looks natural, because when we see it with our eyes, it often, in this kind of instance, will look white to the eyes, and in fact it did on this morning as well. So if we wanted to get a more reasonable look from this, I might bring the shadow detail down slightly and push a little bit of contrast and vibrance into it, and maybe a little bit of clarity, and we start seeing that we have something that looks like more reasonable. So let's do a before and after, and we can see we've just brought some of that detail back, and maybe we'll want to bring some more contrast with the black slider. I think it looks pretty reasonable now. So what I want you to see from this is that we had a file there. This is right on the limits of the dynamic range of the 5D Classic, But look how it's handled it. I think this is a reasonably decent file like this. And if we zoom in again and look around now that we aren't pushing the shadow details so far, we've got perfectly good, clean, usable file. I think this is good. We can look under here and we can see some speckles of noise, but I'm not fussed by that, because why would I be? It doesn't matter in that section. I don't need to see detail. This should be in shade like this. So it's kind of critical that when you're editing that you think about which areas should be dark. Don't try to brighten up stuff that should be quite dark like that. And we'll look here. This is an exposure where I've exposed for the shadows. So this isn't what's referred to as exposing to the right. Exposing to the right means to push your histogram up to the side without blowing the highlights. Here I am blowing the highlights a lot. So that's it. Exposing to the right, or ETTR as it's sometimes referred to, means pushing a histogram up to the right without blowing it. This is exposing to the right beyond that. I'm trying to do here is exposing for the shadows would be to expose to the point where none of the blacks are really showing up as blown, just the tiniest bit in the top left corner there. But essentially I'm retaining all of the shadow detail within the picture. Now the reason you do that is because you want to have clean shadow details. Now do you remember when we were looking at the last file where I exposed for the entirety of the picture? I had to recover the shadows to get this kind of look. Now, if I shoot for the shadows for these areas here, this comes out clean because I'm exposing for these shadow areas. The downside, obviously, is I'm losing these highlights. But I don't need to recover the shadows in this picture. The only thing I'd need to recover would be the highlights. But in a little while, I'm going to combine this picture with a different exposure to show you what that looks like. So if we go over to this picture here, this is an exposure for the highlights. When we look at our histogram over here, we see that it stops just short of the whites at the edge, but we have short for the sky in essence here. So we have all of the highlight details, but our shadows are gone. They're really, really gone. Let's look at what the shadow recovery would be like in this instance. So this again is our ISO 400. Let's pull up all the shadows and let's pull up the exposure as well and see how bad this is or not. And there's a fair amount of color noise. We can see in here there's just a lot of color noise going on, a lot of purple speckles, green speckles. It's quite messy. Zoomed out like this, it looks okay, perhaps a bit, but up here is horrible. It's really kind of mucky looking. But what we're seeing, and what's important to understand when we're looking at noise in digital cameras like this, is that the detail is there. It's sharp underneath. The noise is intruding on the picture, but look at all of these edges. Let's go into 200%. It's going to look horrible, but let's do it. All of these lines here are all sharp. So the camera is still producing a sharp image. It's just that this noise is ruining all of the areas where there is no real detail. In these areas which would just be black, it's just filling in with this noise. But in the areas where we should have detail, like all of these edges around here, we are still seeing good, sharp detail. Now that says a lot for the camera, especially of its age. But this is too noisy. This is unacceptable at this point. So when we zoom back out, I'm just going to reset this. I want to show you, I have this exposure here, which is for the highlights and the shadows are gone. And I have this exposure here, which is for the shadows, which are nice and clean here and don't need any recovery, but the highlights are gone. So what I can do is I can take this exposure, hold down Command or Control on the keyboard and select the other exposure, which is much darker where I expose to the highlights. Right click, I can do Photo Merge, HDR. These are handheld shots, remember. Lightroom will merge these together. I hit merge and it's going to create a new file out of these two that combine the highlight and the shadow detail together. This is not shot on a tripod. This is just shot handheld. And now we have this file where it's put on what it feels to be a good amount of recovery in highlights and shadows. And we have a file where we've just got, I mean, I can pull up the blacks if I want to have more more detail in them, but I've got just lost the detail in here, which is fine, and all of my highlights are recovered. So this now is a file with the full dynamic range for the scene. When we zoom in, we've got those clean shadows from the exposure where I exposed for the shadows, and we have all of the detail in these highlight areas as well. Now, if I hit reset on this file to undo its sort of auto corrections, what we see, this is what I was trying to explain to you before. This file has tons of detail. Let me show you. I'll zoom into here, up the shadow and look up the exposure and look at how much recovery I'm getting, because this is a very high dynamic range file now. If I bring the exposure down, I can get all of the sky back by bringing the exposure down. So I can do some really creative editing with this file now if I want to, because I have tons of dynamic range from this combined file of the highlights and the shadows exposure. My presets for urban photography like this are available in the link in the description as well. Please subscribe to my channel if you like this, give me a thumbs up and drop me a comment as well and let me know what you think, and I'll see you again in the next video. Take care, bye bye.